Dealing with another random making encounter. I know it's been a hot minute since my last video, and I'd really like to thank Christopher over at Townsmith for reaching out to ask about a collaboration. And it really just got me off my lazy butt, out of my doldrums, and in front of the camera again. So a little bit of background. I had been painting this Adeptus Mechanicus Iron Strider 2 years ago. I think it was sitting there, and I was really wanting to make something with it. I wanted to make a book nook or a diorama or something, and I had a bunch of Skitarii minis unpainted, and we know that nobody has unpainted minis laying around, and it was just begging for some sort of a project. I love the Warhammer verse. I love the lore, and the characters, the figures are great. They've got so much personality and character, but I just didn't have an inspiration for the actual project. So when Christopher reached out, he said, hey, we've seen a couple of your videos, and we think that you'd be really interested in trying out this new platform that we're kickstarting. It's for building Battlefield. It's called Battlefield Builder. It's kind of the next evolution or an iteration of this other platform that they have for generating dungeons and buildings called Town Builder. And basically you're able to really throw all sorts of stuff together, build your own environments, build your own buildings, and then chip them out as STLs and throw them on your 3D printer, and you're off to the races with your custom terrain. So as we were talking, we have a great conversation. We're firing on all cylinders. He was in real time generating some ideas on the platform for my project. He chipped those files over to me, flipped them over to me, and I printed them, and this is what the project is really about. It really allowed me to have a custom building set for my miniature scene, my diorama. Now, I'm not going to try to sell you on the Kickstarter. If you're really interested, there is an affiliate link to the Kickstarter in the description below. But I think that the best way to really show what this is capable of is to just look at the project. Now, no big fat envelopes of unmarked sequential bills exchanged hands with me and Townsmith. It is an affiliate link in the description. All of these files were sent free, but beyond that, that's about the extent of the monetary exchange, apart from obviously affiliate links, which obviously all of those help the channel. And if you're interested, be sure to check those out. But I think the proof is in the pudding. And so the best way to really take a look at what this is capable of and what the results are to just look at this little diorama that I threw together. So without any more babble, let's just jump right into the project. These are the files that I was sent, and they printed without supports and without any issues at all. This is on Bamboo Carbon X1. It took about 14 hours, and this was with just the standard 0.2 millimeter layer height, and could have been finer. The details certainly could have been much finer with lower layer heights, but at the expense of more time. I also printed more than I needed, so I could have printed finer and fewer. These are designed to go together with a variety of different connectors. My connector of choice here was super glue, CA glue, and some accelerator, some kicker. And this is really because I am not going to be reconfiguring this terrain. I am going to just be setting and forgetting. The gaps on these are a little pronounced. It's never going to be perfect with 3D printing, but I actually made them worse by trying to sand them, and I ended up melting the plastic. So a little bit of filler did the trick. The next step was to hit it with some primer. This is just some Vallejo black, and then a zenithal highlight, just to pick out some of the highlights and help sort of start to define it. And then some translucent layers of my base wall color. This is my first time painting Warhammer terrain, and Gothic windows take a long time. And then I find once I've got my first base coat on, I just like to slather it with a big wash of sort of mud. And then hours and hours later, this is the magical finished result. Some rust washes, some dry brushing, and I think these are just gorgeous. It turned out really quite nice. In parallel, I was also working on the base, and so I grabbed a chunk of some packing foam and started to figure out really what my composition was going to be. So I wanted it to be dynamic. You know, it's hard to make static things dynamic, and here's where I keep almost breaking that little fiddly bits on it. I did break one of those little antenna things on that iron strider. The idea here, though, is there is some architectural structure to this. So this is a ruin, so there are some rectilinear lines. There are some square shapes, so some steps maybe that led up to whatever this building was. And then the rest of it's just sort of crumbling away. But there should be some rhyme or reason to the composition. So lots of right angles, but then some 45-degree angles. So there's this sort of sight line of the strider that is at a 45-degree angle to that corner. Using the world's least expensive hot wire foam cutter, I started to just chunk out bits and pieces of the foam. The nice thing about this pebbly foam is that it looks like rock when you pick away at it, and it can be cool to add a little bit of texture, let some of that poke through. It's also good to have your foam base a little bit smaller, because if you're using Sculptamold, the thickness of the Sculptamold does add up. It gives you about an extra maybe quarter inch or so of material all the way around. So you got to plan for that a little bit. Sculptamold's a great material because it sets up pretty quickly. It takes a little bit of time to dry, but you can actually trowel it almost to like a flat concrete surface once it starts to set up. Before that, it's like working with cottage cheese, which is kind of gross and doesn't really play nicely, but I love Sculptamold as a material, especially when creating organic terrain. I'm busting out the big old box of foam tiles. These are mostly just leftovers from other projects where I made way too many. It's better to make too many than to run out in the middle. But the idea here again is to create what were foundation walls and maybe the remnants of a tile floor, and then work on all of the steps. At this point, this is where I completely screwed up. This is just some grout and dirt mixed together. And the problem here is that I used too much, and I filled all of the gaps in most of the tiles. And so there was just no definition to dry brush later on. I had to end up individually painting individual tiles, which was just incredibly tedious. So pro tip there is never fill up those spaces too much, especially if you want to, in the end, dry brush and pick out texture later on. Another pro tip is when I add rock, I always work from the biggest, chunkiest thing first and then go to finer and finer materials. So big rocks or big tiles to littler gravel and littler rock to sand to dirt. This is just some sifted dirt. I'm not actually gluing this. I didn't put a glued base down because I'm just going to hit it with some spray scenic glue, DIY scenic glue. So first things first, a coat of alcohol, rubbing alcohol to break the surface tension, and then off camera I'm kind of spritzing on some, basically it's water and Mod Podge that's been diluted and constantly clogs my spray bottle. In the end, you end up with this dirty chunk of foam, which I think it looks weird now. It always looks weird at this point because you've got foam and then there's different rocks and pebbles and this weird blue foam stuff, and it just does not look natural at all. And it's a little disheartening. But if you slather on some inexpensive, espresso brown and black craft paint, it all starts to come together. It really brings it all together. It also helps really set those darks, but you can also see here where the tiles, as I start to dry brush it, the grout lines or the lines between the tiles start to fill in. And that's because of the overfilling that I mentioned. And it just made painting this base that much harder. I wish I could say that I just dry brushed it and man, it just looked amazing and everything was done and I could just move on. But that was not the case. This is just endless layers of washes and then hand picking out tiles and then dry brushing sort of again and then inadvertently filling in the areas that I just painted and then washes and it's just it was not fun actually. At some point though I needed to just decide it was time to glue on the wall. And the reason being is you need to fill all those gaps and you need to blend in the wall. And I didn't want to get too far along on the base and then put a bunch of this raw material back in and then kind of be stuck. But I also didn't want to have to try and paint around the wall for the bulk of it. So there comes a time when you have to decide it's time to glue and then blend. And so here's all of that material blended and matched to hopefully look like it's all part of the same thing. It's always good to remember kind of how you mixed your paints or use paints almost straight out of the bottle. Once I kind of got into final details, I like to use that kind of jewelry resin that's a UV cure resin, and it's nice because it's a great little water effect and it's super easy to use. You just dollop a little bit in, mush it around with a toothpick to get it where you want it to be, and then zap it with a UV, like a little black light flashlight, and it cures up almost immediately. Always be sure to test your resins if they've sat in the bottle for a while, though. They do go bad after a while, and they may not cure, and that would really suck to put a bunch of resin down and hit it with a black light, and then you still end up with this gooey, gummy mess. I speak from experience. All of my tufts, except for the wasteland, were way too green. So this is a bleak landscape. And so I had to find the bleakest colors. There were some good wasteland tufts that worked out pretty well. And they were nice because they had some reddish tones and some green. Here I'm being super precise with my glue application, and I'm going to bust out the tweezers. This is really probably the 2023 YouTube worst example of how to use tweezers on a video. This is just kind of hard to watch and sad because I just glued the foam turf to the tweezers and then it all fell apart, and then I tried to do it again, and then by the end I simply was just grabbing it and just jamming it into the terrain. Thing to note on this is I try to think about where stuff grows, and it generally grows in protected areas, places where seeds or plants kind of fall into seeds, sprout, they take root, and then they're protected from the weather, from elements, from wear and tear, from people traipsing and trampling all over them. So I always try to be very thoughtful about placement and don't just sort of blob it on and plop it in places that plants don't actually grow very well, especially things like this rocky terrain. The base is just some picture frame molding with a 3mm ply tacked in, and then the area in the corner that's exposed will be a resin pour, so I'm painting it with some craft paint to just knock that all back. It turned out to be almost practically useless to do this in the end, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Hot glue to seal it. Resin finds a way to get through everything, and in fact, even though I sealed all of these edges with hot glue, I think some of the resin actually crept through one of the miter joints and almost glued the whole project to my benchtop, which would have really not been fun. The base here is actually at this point pretty much done, the foam part. And so I'm gluing it with some PVA, some tacky glue onto the actual frame and then getting it ready for the resin pour. It's always nice to have some cast rocks floating around. So I cast a lot of rocks for projects using some molds that I have and some plaster casting material. And they're just I have bags of these things kind of kicking around. And so I happen to have a few that worked out pretty well with this terrain. I'm not really sure what that little weird channel is, but you can tell some stories about, oh, that's something that they float something through. That's where they throw all of the bodies, I guess. That's dark. That was way too dark. Sorry about that. Here I'm using the 2-part resin for the pour, and I forgot how powerful the pigments are. And so this is basically just like solid, muddy chalk. This is like the darkest espresso that you can possibly buy. It's way too dark. It really negated any painting and any transparency. So the power tip, are we on power tip maybe number 3 here? Power tip number 3 is to use a toothpick and just put the tiniest amounts of colorant on your resin and then work it up rather than just blobbing a big dollop of it like I did and then ending up with a whole batch of resin that was way too dark. Now, thankfully, this is not the hero part of the diorama. This is way, way in the background. This is, this is just mostly filler. So I didn't feel it was really worth wasting the resin and actually mixing a new batch. The transparency wasn't super critical. It's mostly just to create a cool visual interest and give the rocks something to be embedded in. Gives it a little bit of texture. As you're thinking about dioramas, really the idea is variety of textures. There's stone, there's foliage, there's that idea of puddles and water. And then this is just a little hot air gun that I use for shrinking heat shrink, but it works really well popping bubbles on resin. You can also use a straw and just blow on it. People use propane torches or like those little creme brulee torches. Now I want creme brulee. But I feel those feel a little aggressive, and it turns out that this little handheld heat gun heats up lightning fast and is lightweight and tiny and works really well for a variety of things. In particular, again, I use it a lot on heat shrink. At this point, it's just waiting way too long for the resin to cure. I'm an impatient person, as you've maybe heard in previous videos, and this is a good 24 hours for this resin to cure and set up. But this worked out really well. This resin, I'll put a link in the description. It worked really well, and it sort of debubbled, degassed nicely on its own. I didn't need to fuss with it a lot with that heat gun. It's a little glossy and slick for me, so I used some of this wave texture material. Woodland Scenics, they've got a lot of great cool materials. I am no pro at this, and so I'm sure there is a much better technique to do these little waves with this material. It is a fun material to work with, though. It's like a clear gel, but I just kind of sort of semi-suck at it. So the idea, though, is to really just dab it and leave some open areas of resin. Now we're in the home stretch. We're getting to glue the actual characters, the figures down. And as always, I went too heavy on the glue, a little excessive. Maybe better too much than too little. You don't want it flying off and busting another antenna off of it. But this is where the storytelling comes in and trying to figure out what that logical position is. So we have our Iron Strider pointing off. We got our little Skitarii dude here with the scanner. He's clearly concerned about something. Got a little dude posted up here covering the flank. And then I had some empty space over behind the wall, and it would have been kind of wasted to just have my third guy over in the main area. So to draw the eye around to that extra space on the other side of the wall, that's where I decided to place my third figure. Have him come running around that corner, ready to help out. And with that, and this little extra cap to support him because he was sprinting on one foot, the diorama was complete.